So stride piano is a conceptually simple but technically difficult left-hand technique that was widely used by early jazz pianists. It involves alternating between a bass note and a chord, with the bass note playing on beats 1 and 3 and the chord playing on beats 2 and 4. This creates a kind of oompa sound where you go bass chord, bass chord, bass chord, and so on. And because with this technique you're playing on every beat, it creates quite a powerful and driving rhythm. And for that reason, it's a great technique for solo piano. Typically, the bass note would be a root or a fifth. So say if we wanted to play the chord C6, we could play it as follows. Right? Root, chord, fifth chord, root, chord, fifth chord, and so on. But you can, of course, vary this up. Say by adding a third in there and thus playing a bit of an arpeggio. Or by walking the bass note up, especially up to the root note of the next chord. So for example, if we wanted to play a 2-5, and instead of single bass notes, you could also play an octave or a tenth. Similarly, the chord is typically some triad or seventh chord in some inversion, or some fragment of the chord, such as just the guide tones, the third and the seventh, for example. But you could also use other voicings for the chord, such as rootless voicings. Or causal voicings or any other voicing. And of course you could also use chord substitutions, passing chords, and all the other harmonic ideas or concepts also found in jazz. But this technique can get a bit boring to listen to after a while because it's so repetitive. So you can vary it up a little bit by doing reverse stride, so going chord, bass, instead of bass, chord, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. You could also mix it up with a walking bass line. Or play 2 bass notes or 2 chords in a row to vary up the rhythm a little bit and thus kind of make it sound like 3/4 time for a moment. Or you could break the rhythm a little bit by anticipating a bass note or a chord. Now what makes this technique challenging is the need to jump a fair distance to get from the bass note to the chord and back. So when you're first learning this technique, you want to minimize the distance you need to jump and minimize the complexity of the chords. A good way of doing this is by using tenth triads. Pick a relatively simple song that uses a lot of 2/5s, preferably where the chords change every half bar, so like Satin Doll, and then learn to play it as follows. So our 2 chord is going to be a 10th triad, so we're going to spread the interval of a 10th. The root note is going to be our bass note, and then our chord is going to be the 5th and the 3rd played together with the 3rd above the 5th. Then for the 5 chord, we're going to go root, and then the guide tones 3 and 7. And if you've done this correctly over a 2/5, then the 3rd in your 2 chord should be the same note as the 7th in your 5 chord. And then when we eventually play the 1, we'll again play a 10th triad. So root 5/3. Now the idea here is to really minimize the amount of movement in your hand so that you're not jumping multiple octaves. The idea is we kind of keep our hand ready in this position so that we don't really have to jump. We kind of just need to rotate our wrist from the root note to the chord. Now, if your hand isn't wide enough to reach a tenth, great, that's fine. That's why we're doing a stride pattern. So you're going to have to kind of move your wrists and your hand slightly to reach up to that tenth or third, an octave higher. If your hand can reach a tenth, you still want to kind of rotate your wrist a little bit to get that stride pattern going. So as I said, you want to keep your hand roughly in that position because we want to have it ready there to play those chords. You don't want to jump back here and sort of bunch up your hands together to play this root note, because then there's a big distance to jump back up to your third and fifth. You do want to move as little as possible so that you can kind of just feel where the right notes are on the piano, instead of having to really look at it, because really all our attention should be on the right hand playing the melody. So using this technique, you could play Satin Doll as follows. Right, so you see my hand's not moving around very much, it's kind of keeping that position, but it's still got that kind of stride feel happening. But because I don't have to jump around too much, it's much easier. Once you can do that beginner version relatively well, then you can try a slightly more intermediate version where we play the root note and then the seventh chord. Or if you can't do a seventh chord, just a triad. Again, in any inversion. So here you are obviously jumping a little bit more, so it is going to take a little bit more practice to get this up to the same level as the beginner version, but it's not impossible. It may just take you, a couple of months. And notice also that I'm picking inversions of the chords such that they connect relatively smoothly and they're all roughly in the same area, and so that I'm not jumping too far. I'm not going, D down here and then a second inversion D here so that I have to jump an octave and a half. I would try and generally avoid jumping more than an octave. And finally, an advanced version of this could be, say, using rootless voicings. Cool, and if you wanted to make that even more advanced, you could do all the things I mentioned earlier in the video about, putting octaves instead of a single bass note, or interspersing it with a walking bass line, and doing all those other things. So this is a fun and cool sounding technique to learn, but it is quite technically difficult, again, because you're moving around a lot. So make sure you practice this slowly and with the left hand separately. And as I mentioned, this is quite a difficult technique to master, so do be patient. Because obviously, ultimately, we want to be able to improvise over this technique, which means that it kind of has to be on autopilot to some extent, and just in your muscle memory as much as possible. And that may take months, if not years. Cool, and also go have a listen to some stride pianists, some of which I've listed up here in the picture-in-picture, to get some inspiration. But just be mindful that some of these guys are absolute machines and just played lightning fast stride, which I wouldn't recommend trying at home. So you've been warned, just be careful. Cool, see you guys, bye.